Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, zombies. Dr. Dylan George is the director of the new Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk about what we can learn from science fiction about pandemic preparedness. Let's listen.
Dr. Dylan George, thank you so much for joining us in Public Health on Call. You work at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in outbreak analytics. We'll talk about your job a little bit, but I want to start with why I'm calling you, which is I heard you gave a presentation at AwesomeCon. And my first question is, what is AwesomeCon?
Yeah, AwesomeCon is a big gathering where people come together to talk about comic books, movies, and various kind of like sci-fi culture and things along those lines. And so everybody comes together. Everyone's in costume. I wasn't. I was dressed as a scientist, I guess. But it's a really great coming together. It's kind of like a Comic-Con in DC. Yeah.
Did anyone ask you what's a scientist like you doing in a place like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. A colleague of mine at the National Science Foundation, a man by the name of Dr. Sam Shiner, who I actually used to work for at the National Science Foundation. He has been going to AwesomeCon to talk about a range of different science questions for a handful of years. This year, they put together a panel called Pandemics, Myth and Reality in Popular Culture. And he asked me and Dr. Colin Carlson from Georgetown to come and sit on a panel with him and talk to people attending AwesomeCon about pandemics, what have been some of the representations in comics and movies, and what was myth and what was reality, and how we can think about it differently. And so it was a really fun event, and it was fun to be on a panel with Sam as well. He's been he was my boss at one point. He's become a mentor and a good friend, and so it was really great people to be on a panel with. Yeah.
I wish I could have been there, but I'm going to ask you about it. So let's pick one representation of a pandemic just to start with, maybe one that's been in the media recently.
Yeah, one of them was a really popular sort of story right now is Last of Us, and we talked about some of the what the story was like and what we could learn from that as well, because a lot of people have been talking about that particular movie.
I think it has something to do with fungus, but that's about all I know.
Exactly. It's a fungus has been infecting individuals and turning them into a zombie state. And then it gives a dystopian world that we go into from the standard sort of zombie movies. Yeah.
Now, you know an awful lot about outbreaks. When you're looking at the passage of the fungus that's turning people into zombies, does it resonate in any way with other infectious diseases that you're familiar with?
Oh, absolutely. It's we can think of, it's like the way we do it in standard modeling is we think about susceptible, infected, recovered individuals, and then we write down equations that will help us tell how people move between those different groups. And you can look at these kinds of movies in the same sort of way, and how do people move from the susceptible to the infected to the recovered or passed on scenarios. And so it happens in a distorted way from what happens in reality, but it's the same sort of general principles. Yeah.
I have this feeling that like people are watching the TV and they're watching someone become a zombie, and you're thinking, okay, we can move them from susceptible to infected at this point.
Exactly. That's the general idea. Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned that society breaks down. And I guess I picked this up from maybe some of the posters for The Last of Us, where it doesn't look like a normal day at the office in the posters. So is that relevant for us in the world of the CDC and all that?
Yeah, no, I mean, from a standpoint of storytelling, it's really useful. I mean, there's a long history of creating a frame story to tell other kind of really more substantive stories. I mean, the Decameron is an example of this, where it was like set in medieval time, where we're in Europe in the plague, and then there was many stories about how people were interacting. This is the same sort of concept, where you have a frame story of the pandemic put us into a dystopian sort of broken down world from the and how do we actually interact with one another from a storytelling perspective. It's really interesting because it allows us to ask questions of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be in civil society, how do we actually organize and interact with one another. So from that standpoint, there's similarities. Also, that breakdown of society, I think, is one of the key principles that we need to think about with pandemics.
Tell me more about that. I'm thinking back to the early days of a recent pandemic we all know well.
Yeah, no, I mean, in the early stages of COVID-19, we definitely saw how civil society frayed in the early stages. We saw there weren't as many resources in groceries because we have just-in-time inventory capabilities. I think toilet paper being on the fritz or not being available, pasta, you could only buy so much pasta in the groceries. And those are just early stage examples. Now, think of if we didn't have electricity on a consistent basis, if we didn't have gasoline on a consistent basis, if we didn't have the internet on a consistent basis or other communications, it would push us into a very different realm of how we would interact with one another and fray society in a different way. And I don't think that one of the things that's really nice about the zombie movies is that it really helps us, just think about a fun kind of different situation and talk about different issues. But I don't think we should discount the reality that this could actually happen. And I think the beginning of those stages we saw in COVID-19 is an example of that.
And in other words, it's sort of a sign to communities to think about resilience more broadly than just a couple days of maybe no electricity or limited access to toilet paper.
Absolutely, 100%. We need to think about resilience, and we need to think about how we're actually going to play and interact with one another in those troubling times.
Let's talk about another example, maybe a book.
There's this classic book that Joseph Campbell wrote a while ago, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. That was, one of the inspirations with George Lucas for Star Wars in talking about the hero's journey, going from a struggle, epiphany, and then looking at success and going forward to define what the hero's journey looks like. I think you see this in science fiction very frequently and very, very commonly. In a lot of ways.
Are you kind of referring to how these stories tend to focus on like one person? The whole society is affected, but like somehow one person, usually a guy, is fighting back.
Exactly. And so there's that's a standard sort of technique in storytelling, which is really effective, really good. I mean, actually, there's a good story that Will Smith was in, I Am Legend. It was a story of another zombie sort of movie where he was the lone military scientist that was trying to come up with a solution, a cure for this. And then it was all focused on that individual's struggle to try to come up with this cure going forward. The individual is the focus of going forward. And for storytelling, that's really effective. But I think that this is where it diverges from reality when we think about how we actually, what is public health and what is, how do we respond to pandemics? It's a team sport.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit more. What does the team sport look like?
Well, when I was, when I was trying to get my 6-year-old son a vaccine, and the nurse at the pharmacy was able to actually give him that vaccination for that first one. First of all, it was one of those moments that is going to be singular for me throughout the pandemic, because now my son was starting to develop an immunological protection so he could interact with society in a completely different way, in a much more free way. That nurse was my hero of the pandemic. I still remember her face vividly when she was able to give that jab to my son. But the systems that we had in place to allow that nurse to actually get that vaccine in his arm were pretty impressive. We had to have teams of scientists that made the vaccine. And this took over 20, 25 years to get that vaccine. We had to have teams that actually distributed the vaccine from the manufacturing plants to the various pharmacies. Then we had to have data systems that allowed us to actually track what was going, so we knew how it was getting out going forward. We had to have policymakers that were actually getting the funding so that could actually all happen going forward. And then we had to have the communicators that were helping people understand the value of the vaccine and how to actually access it going forward. This is a team sport. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question, which is premised on the idea that we've covered in the podcast quite a lot, that we do not invest in a lot of those activities that you just mentioned, maybe as well as we should, and that the public health system is kind of weak, particularly heading into the pandemic. Do you think that could be linked to the fact that when we tell ourselves stories about these huge challenges, they have singular heroes, and we don't really focus on how we can get together to solve problems?
Yeah, I think that the singular hero lends itself to really good storytelling, but very bad policy. Yeah, and we do need to invest in these over longer periods of time, and because it does take a team to actually make these things happen, and we need to have sustained resources to be resilient in a time of crisis like that, so it doesn't take a Herculean effort, but rather that we can actually do it on a consistent basis. Completely agree. Yeah.
Let's take one more example. What do you want to pick from anywhere in the realm of science fiction?
So I think one of the movie that everyone talks about when you're talking about pandemics in popular culture is Contagion. And I think this was a really amazing movie. It was done by Participant Media. They were actually had some really impressive science advisors on this, like people like Larry Brilliant and Mark Smolinski and John Brownstein and a handful of others that were actually helping them understand what is needed to actually fight a pandemic.
And let's just remind everyone what Contagion was about in case you either have never watched it or, like me, watched it but tried very quickly to forget it because it was causing me nightmares.
Yeah, no, it gives you a little bit of a PTSD, I think, at this point too. It's so Contagion was a movie of an individual came home from a trip over in Asia and actually started developing a cold, thought there was just kind of like jet lag, ended up having a fairly serious infection of a Nipah-like virus that infected her in South Asia. She came home, infected her family and a handful of people on the trip home, and started spreading this virus to others and quickly died. And then it tells the story of how that pandemic then unfolded for that family and those group of people, and then the world broadly. And it became a global pandemic like we had seen with COVID.
Since there were science advisors, they nailed it? Or were there some things where you would say, hold on, we got to take something into account here?
You know, like I said, of popular culture, I think it was one of the more realistic sorts of movies out there. And like you said, it's like when I watched it again in preparation for AwesomeCon, and I had a little bit of PTSD as watching it again. The other thing that was amazing was, like, it was interesting to see how much they got right in repression in terms of miscommunication and disinformation and things that were out there as well. But there were some things that were not quite right in the movie as well. And again, for the compression for storytelling and everything. For example, how to understand the data the pandemic is unfolding, and how they were actually collecting data and how they were presenting data. And doing the algorithm, it's much, much more challenging than what was presented in the movie. Yeah.
And this is of more than passing interest to you.
Exactly. This is one of the reasons why I left the private sector to come back to the federal government to help build this new Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics. Is the previous director of the CDC recruited me from the private sector to come and build this going forward. The main mission of this new center is to use data as a superpower to build a better evidence base to fight pandemics going forward. So that's why I came back to CDC. Yeah.
In Contagion, the data sort of magically appears when it's necessary, but in the real world, we need a greater capacity to figure out what's going on.
Exactly. We need to improve the data systems. We need to improve the algorithms that we're using, and we need to support those that are collecting that data to kind of move things forward. And that's one of the reasons why I came back to try to help build those kinds of systems and those teams to make that happen better.
And where are we now in that effort?
It's thanks for asking. It's like we launched the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics officially in January of this year. We started as a team of 5. Now we have about a head count of about 50, and it is an impressive group of folks that we've been able to bring together. They're people that have left tenure track positions in academia to come help us build this because they see the mission as so important. We're starting to build the tools, we're starting to build the teams, we're starting to build the partnerships. So we're well on our way to actually making a lasting impact. And so it's exciting to see the progress that we're making right now.
Yeah, I can tell you are envisioning much more rapid, effective data to really help with the response, not just at the national level, but at community levels too. Is that right?
Exactly. It's we take a lot of inspiration from looking at how weather forecasting has transformed over the last 50 years or so. I mean, to the point that we all have mobile devices now, and if you have an Apple mobile device, you can actually see in their weather app, you can see hyper local information about when rain is coming through, what's the precipitation going to be like, what is the temperature, what is going to be the humidity, and in a very, very localized way. We take a lot of inspiration, and aspirationally, we want to build to that so that we can enable individuals, mayors, and governors to have the information so that they can be empowered to make decisions to keep themselves, their families, and their communities safe from infectious diseases.
It sounds a little bit like science fiction, but it's going to be exciting to see that play out. Let me ask you this. On the other end of having accomplished that, you've done it. We've all got this great access to tools about our potential risk, and it's informing governments. Do you think there's a scenario where people start to dress up like you and your colleagues at AwesomeCon? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think we're gratefully, I think, not in that realm, but
you never know. You never know. We'll see. We'll keep an eye on AwesomeCon. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast, telling us about this. We can learn a lot from science fiction, even if it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Exactly. Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.